I'm really pleased that we're having this workshop at the LBJ School at a time that is so important in our history, both in terms of public policy and in our society. And I want to thank the Provost's office. I want to thank the government department and, of course, our community here at LBJ for helping support this. And I want to thank Peniel, and I'll thank Peniel in just a bit as soon as I introduce the president of the university. It is really my honor and privilege to introduce, and this is the first time I'm introducing him, so this is an inaugural introduction for me as well, Greg Fenfez, and he was formally inaugurated as the 29th president of the University of Texas at Austin in September 17th. And I was listening to his speech when he was inaugurated, and he had some really powerful statements that hold true not only for the university but for the LBJ School, and also reflective of what we're doing here tonight. They just fit so well. He talked about the importance of knowledge and research and bringing knowledge into a world where it makes a big impact so that our eyes are on discoveries that can really make a difference in the community, and how important research and good data are in terms of our ability to make good decisions no matter where we are and no matter what we're doing. So I thought that was really important. The other thing I thought that was really important in his speech to us was the importance of collaboration and working across disciplines and across lines of where before people may have been reluctant to do that. We need to do more and more of that. So we have to be inclusive. So not only inclusive in terms of who we work with whatever, but also inclusive and open-minded about different kinds of disciplines and approaches to public policy problems. He described an innovative environment. He called it an incubator. And so what I see this conference is an incubator. Let's get together, let's put some materials together, and let's see what grows out of this, both in terms of knowledge from the past, but also working toward the future in terms of our challenges. So we at the LBJ School and the Center, on behalf of the Center, we really want to welcome President Fenfez here tonight and thank him very much for coming. So, Greg?
Well, good evening, and thank you for that introduction. That was the first time I've been introduced by the new dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Angela Evans, so thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be here to open up the inaugural national conference on the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the LBJ School. And let me put a plug in for Peniel Joseph. We are so glad to have you at the University of Texas campus. In chatting a few minutes before the event, I see you have some of your former colleagues from the Boston area that are very glad to show off Peniel here in his new home here in Austin. Last year, the University of Texas celebrated the 50th anniversary of LBJ signing the Civil Rights Act. And for those of you that are in our community or were here visiting at the events with the LBJ Library and the LBJ School of Public Affairs, it really was a monumental event. Of course, it got a lot of attention with 4 U.S. presidents having been here to talk about that seminal moment in U.S. history with the signing of the Civil Rights Act by President Johnson. We're entering in another series of 50th anniversaries and are very pleased to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's movement to end housing segregation and improve the services for rural America and African Americans, an issue that still persists today. And that's why I think this conference is so important to bring national leaders in dialogue to talk about race in modern America and the future. This is also 2016, a 60th anniversary for the University of Texas. 1956 was when the first African-American undergraduate students began at the University of Texas. And one of the things we'll be working with the preceptors, the early pioneers, the African-American students who entered the university after 70 years of segregation, is later in 2016 looking at a way of remembering and thinking about the past, but also looking towards the future. Because race still matters in American society. The Pew Research Center tracks American public opinion on race relations in the U.S. and reports today that nearly half of half the Americans view racism in society today as a major problem, and that's up from previous surveys. And a majority of Americans in the country think, and I'm glad they think, that we need to continue to make progress to assure equality and equal rights for all Americans, including African Americans. And so I want to congratulate Peniel for bringing this conference together, and I want to thank him for coming to the University of Texas to relocate your center on the study of race and democracy. It is at the center of so much of the crucial issues facing society. It is at the center of what we're thinking about at the university, as are many universities, thinking about the issues of race and racism and how we continue to make progress that began a long time ago by so many people, but of which now this 2016 is the 50th anniversary of so many important events in the civil rights movement. So thank you for being here, and very much look forward to the discussions and particularly the outcomes of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to get right to it. So let me just take this opportunity to reintroduce Peniel Joseph. And I think I'm just echoing what Greg said and what we said this morning. So, Peniel, you want to just come on up? We're very lucky to have Peniel. This conference is a new inaugural push for us, so we hope we can do more of this. We've got some wonderful people here to tell stories, not only historical stories, but personal stories. And we have the next generation sitting here, too, in terms of leaders. So we're anxious to hear this evening's workshop. Peniel.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, President Fembez and Dean Evans. I want to start by thanking the extraordinary work of Loveday Grossman and Susan Binford of the LBJ School, who helped all this happen, and their support team and their support staff who helped this happen. The center has a new program associate, Asley. I don't know if Asley is still here. I want to thank her. I want to really thank the people who helped me help the center, and then the individual people who helped recruit me. One, certainly the president's office, the provost's office, Dean Randy Deal in the College of Liberal Arts, Greg Vincent, who's the vice president of the Department of Diversity here at Tufts. At Texas. People have been mentioning Tufts so much that you guys are just, you guys did this to me, including this group of friends from Boston, just, here at Austin. Len Moore, who's a professor of history here and works in the Department of Diversity as well, has been crucial to me coming here. Jeremy Suri. Jeremy Suri is awesome. And he's a great historian and policy expert and a great friend. And he was instrumental in me coming here as well. And really thanks to everybody at the LBJ School and the Department of History, Jackie Jones, my colleagues there, who were all instrumental in helping facilitate my arrival in Austin. Ed Dorn at the LBJ School, hugely influential, former dean of the LBJ School, and he's going to be presenting tomorrow. He's been hugely helpful and influential here too. So thank you to all of you. It's been an incredible welcoming. I also want to thank Charlayne Hunter Gault, because our keynote this afternoon was absolutely brilliant. She's a journalist and a civil rights icon who really has been influential on my own scholarship. When I was writing about the civil rights movement, I found out about Charlayne's story through history books, but then I read her journalism, and she's done extraordinary work. And the work she did at the New York Times in the 1970s is really groundbreaking, because she was a civil rights trailblazer who then was covering aspects of American politics, race politics, and really writing wonderfully sophisticated journalistic analyses of what was going on in the early and mid-1970s. And there's particularly one long story she did for the New York Times in 1975 about what happened to the civil rights struggle. That is one of the best pieces of journalism that you can read from that period, analyzing what's going on in terms of black women, men, feminism, public policy, the demonstrations, the move from protest to politics, elected officials. What does it mean within the context of American democracy in the mid-'70s? And it's really startling because Dr. King had been assassinated less than 10 years before. We were on our way to something, but we were still in the middle of a maelstrom. And to provide that kind of clear, lucid, analytical framework is very, very important. So I want to
I hope you have a copy of it, because I don't.
I do have a copy of it. That's the thing about being a historian. So what we're going to do today is talk about civil rights and public policy, and I'm going to take a seat. And I know Len Moore is going to be talking about athletics, and I'm going to ask Charlayne some questions about really solutions, because she's working on really a wonderful series for PBS called Race Matters. And I've seen most of it, and I saw the episode she did with Pedro Noguera, who's a friend and one of the most important educational specialists in the country who teaches at UCLA now. But they were talking about solutions and what Pedro is trying to do. And I want you tonight to talk about that as well. But what I want to talk about before opening up the floor is really, why are we here today? I think that we stand at an extraordinary moment in American history. And I think it's a moment that, even as on one level it's steeped in tragedy, it's a moment we can all be proud of, because it is leading to a transformative impetus and impulse right here in the United States. When we think about historically the notion of race and democracy, the reason why I argue as a scholar that it stands at the core of our story is empirical. President Fenves talked in his address, and I'm alluding to what Dean Evans said, about data and empiricism. When we look at the data, when we look at how American democracy was forged and formed, race is at the core of that story, not just through racial slavery, but even race connected to immigration and how immigrants were considered on this shore. On one level, we note, like Walt Whitman said, that we're not just a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. At the same time, we've been a country that suffered from what people called nativism, right? And nativism was racism. People who were Hungarian, who were Italian, who were Polish, who were German, who were Irish, suffered from what we call nativism. Even as we note that over 3,700 African Americans were lynched between 1880 and 1932, there's also going to be immigrant Americans who are also lynched during that time. Not in the same numbers, but they are part of that story too. So when we think about race and democracy, it stands at the core of our story because we are a country founded on individual principles of liberty and freedom and the pursuit of happiness, yet the core irony is that it's juxtaposed against antebellum slavery. It's juxtaposed against women not having the right to vote until 1920. It's juxtaposed against Chinese American exclusion acts. It's juxtaposed against anti-immigration acts that it took Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society to really transform in a substantive way, where our policies lived up to our ideals. And when we think about this heroic period of the civil rights movement between 1954 and 1965, and when I say that heroic period of the civil rights movement, I'm talking about between May 17th, 1954, and the Brown Supreme Court desegregation decision, all the way up to August 6, 1965, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And in between, we've got a cinematic unspooling of that heroic period of the civil rights movement. We've got Emmett Till's assassination in Mississippi in 1955, August 28th, 1955. 14-year-old black boy who is assassinated for saying "bye, baby" to the wife of a white shop owner. Till's body is going to be found in the Tallahatchie River with a 125-pound cotton gin fan belt tied around his neck. His mother is going to allow his an open casket funeral, and it's going to be the cover of Jet magazine. So in 1955, that's what young African Americans see when they look at Jet magazine in the summer of 1955. A 14-year-old in Mississippi who shot, disfigured, shot in the head twice, disfigured, assassinated for defying racial etiquette in Mississippi in 1955. Emmett Till's two murderers are going to go free and sell their story to Look magazine for $4,000. And that's American democracy in 1955. But that same year, Rosa Parks, December 1st, she refuses to give up her seat. Montgomery bus boycott starts, a 381-day bus boycott that helps propel this heroic period of the civil rights movement and introduces a 26-year-old young preacher from Atlanta named Martin Luther King Jr., who becomes a national spokesperson for this incipient civil rights struggle. 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas, the desegregation of Little Rock, Arkansas. There's mob violence, the kind of mob violence that Charlayne Hunter Gault is going to have to face in 1961 when she desegregates the University of Georgia with Hamilton Homes. 1960 is the start of the sit-in movement, a movement of direct action where 4 African-American college students, February 1st, 1960, tried to gain access to a lunch counter at a Woolworths, an all-white lunch counter, February 1st, 1960. And what that's going to propel, and the reason why this story is so inspiring, 4 start that sit-in movement in 1960, and when we look at the data, over 50,000 students participate, including outside of the South, in civil rights demonstrations in the spring of 1960. So this idea of small d democracy in this heroic period of the civil rights movement, the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the spring of 1960, interracial groups of civil rights activists who are saying that small d democracy, one person, one vote, citizenship that goes beyond the vote can actually transform the lives of everyone in this country. It's something that's truly extraordinary. By 1961, the Freedom Rides during the Kennedy administration, where young groups of interracial demonstrators go down south to try to defy racial segregation along interstate highways. They're going to be attacked with mob violence May 4th, 1961 in Anniston, Alabama. They continue. There's going to be over 50 freedom rides between May 4th, 1961 and December of 1961. People go to jail to try to transform our society. 1962, James Meredith becomes the first African-American graduate student at the University of Mississippi. There's going to be 3 days of violence in Mississippi because James Meredith enrolls at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. 1963 is the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's also the year of Birmingham. And we've got the Pulitzer Prize winning author of Carry Me Home, the definitive book on Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, Diane McWhorter with us right here. And Birmingham is where Martin Luther King Jr. connects with a local movement led by the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to try to transform municipal politics and policies in Birmingham. He's in jail in Birmingham, and that's where he writes Letter from a Birmingham Jail on scraps of paper, and it's where he says the young people in Birmingham, Alabama are one day going to be remembered as heroes for what King describes bringing us all back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. So when we say, why are we here today? We're here today to try to connect with those great wells of democracy that Dr. King was talking about from a Birmingham jail in 1963. We're here today because on August 28, 1963, the first lines from Dr. King's mouth at the March on Washington were, "Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy." Extraordinary. 1964, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, July 2nd. But that signing is punctuated by the deaths of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, right? Andrew Goodman, James Cheney, Michael Schwerner, nonviolent civil rights activists who are going to be killed right outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. They go missing at 10:30 p.m., June 21st, 1964. Their bodies are going to be found August 4th, 1964, in an earthen dam. They become martyrs of a movement that is about more than just racial equality. It's about economic justice and how we define ourselves as Americans. 1965, the Voting Rights Act could not be passed without Selma. March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday in Selma, where 500 nonviolent demonstrators are going to be beaten with truncheons by state police officers, nonviolent demonstrators. And it's going to move the nation to the point that thousands of people go to Selma to bear witness to what's happening in the United States. March 15th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson, in a joint address to the United States Congress, compares the nonviolent demonstrators in Selma to American revolutionaries who fought in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, and says that we shall overcome. We have a sitting American president who says that the civil rights movement is not only a moral good, it's a political good, and it reflects the very best of American democracy. So the reason we're here today is that 50 years later, 51 to be technical, the issues and challenges we faced continue to contour all of our lives. When we see this movement for Black Lives Matter, when we see a movement to end mass incarceration, when we see housing and urban development announcing plans to try to desegregate cities that are willing to desegregate, when we see public schools that in some cases are more racially segregated now than they were in the late 60s and the early 1970s, we understand that the same problems that we faced in the context of the heroic period of the civil rights movement, even as we have experienced some successes. Probably our biggest example of this is the election of an African-American president, Barack Obama. Even as we have more African Americans who have more wealth than at any other time in American history. Even as we have a Black middle and upper middle class that dwarfs the one that was in existence in 1965. We also have about 1 million African Americans who languish in federal and state and local prisons, which is exponentially higher than the number who were incarcerated when the Voting Rights Act was passed. So these issues continue to contour all of our lives. And I think what is so extraordinary about the past 18 months is the fact that we've been able to discuss these issues with a clarity and an honesty and an openness that we haven't been able to in a very, very long time. And for those of us who are educators, that's key. When we talk about teachable moments, we're not kidding. When you can talk about a problem, and Charlayne Hunter Gault was talking about this earlier, that's how you can find a solution to a problem. So we know these inequalities are happening. We know that there are racial and economic gender disparities. We know that it continues to impact our institutions, including right here at UT and all the institutions that I've worked at. But what's so exciting and what's so optimistic for me, and the reason why I'm hopeful, is that we are finally having this conversation about race and democracy that we should have been having for a very, very long time. And it's through that conversation that we can actually make change and we can actually have progress. And so I'm very, very proud that the LBJ School and UT have really seen fit that a Center for the Study of Race and Democracy is connected to our research agenda It's connected to our core mission. It's connected to our core values of who we want to be as educators, as faculty, as staff, as students, as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as innovators, right? It's connected. That was my warm-up talk. So now I'm going to sit down, and I want to introduce Professor Leonard Moore, who is a great historian in his own right, has written wonderful work on the civil rights movement, Black Power, also on policing and incarceration. He's going to talk with us about policy, sports, all these different,
All right, thank you. Oh, sit down? Oh, okay, sit down. All right. So I want to throw a couple images up. So this will be part memoir, part Pentecostal sermon, all rolled in one. Just so you know, I teach about 1,150 undergrads every fall. So my life is pretty much spent managing a large portfolio of academic programs and also really mentoring undergraduates. I went to Jackson State University, an historically black college. And it was a university at the time that was open admissions, okay? If you were breathing and could produce a high school diploma, they let you in. But I am thankful for those institutions, because if those institutions weren't around, I mean, they provided opportunity when so many other places wouldn't let us in. And so I began my career as a professor at LSU in 1998. Great people, good food, but the most bizarre environment I've ever been in my life. And I was rescued and brought to UT in 2007. And so I just want to just have a conversation about race, public policy, and college athletics. And I sort of titled this, Race, Public Policy, College Athletics, from the OJ verdict till the Missouri boycott, all right? So you see the photograph we have on the screen. Can anybody identify the folk in this photograph? Bill Russell. Can anybody go back row? Bobby Mitchell played for the Redskins. Carl Stokes, mayor of Cleveland, 67. Anybody else? No, not Lynn Swan. Not Lynn Swan. And you got John Wooten on the end there. And so this is in 1967 in Cleveland. They have this gathering. Jim Brown, when he stopped playing for the Browns, created something called the Black Economic Union, and it was designed to get African-American athletes to go into entrepreneurship and to build businesses in black communities. And what you should know about Jim Brown, John Wooten, and some of the other people who played for the Browns, they lived on the east side of Cleveland, and some of them taught high school in the off season. So very much they were in the community. Now, why this is important is because Jim Brown had called them to Cleveland because they wanted to talk to Ali, all right? They wanted to know, man, how come you're not going to the draft? They had set it up where he could just go box. And Ali said, well, how about you bring folks together? And so this is that meeting in Cleveland. Now, the catalyst for this event is the 1960 Olympics. So what happens in the 1960 Olympics? And it has nothing to do with Cassius Clay. Yes, 1960, Rome, Wilma Rudolph, the Gazelle. She wins 3 gold medals, the 100, the 200, and then the 4x100 meters is her and her 3 teammates from the all-black Tennessee State. She goes home to Tennessee. They want to have a parade for her in segregated Clarksville, Tennessee. She says, if it's going to be segregated, I'm not going to participate. So Clarksville, Tennessee is integrated off the athletic exploits of a black woman. Now, we got to remember, Wilma Rudolph goes to the Olympics in 56 as a 16-year-old and gets the bronze medal. So we like to talk about the 60 Olympics and talking about Ali came home and threw his medal in the Ohio River, but Wilma Rudolph is the sister that is conscious, right? And then the government hires her after the Olympics to be these goodwill ambassadors, but when she's going throughout the diaspora, she's becoming more conscious about the effects of colonialism on African people, all right? So I just wanted to start there. Now, the second thing they discussed at this meeting, which is important for today, is that not only are they talking about Ali, and Ali gives his rationale why he won't fight, and they support it, but they also talk about who's going to protect the rights of amateur black athletes. Because they understand in 1967, The arms race has just begun for black athletic talent. And they are talking then about, okay, here comes Alabama, here comes LSU, here comes Texas, here comes Florida, here comes Alabama. They knew, in many ways, they were prophetic. And what we see today implies that they were right. And it's funny, I tell people that my kids, when I worked at LSU, my kids thought LSU was a historically black college. Because when they watched the football games, that's all they saw, all right? And I remember growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, in the suburbs of Cleveland, being a big fan of Georgetown and John Thompson. I thought Georgetown was HBCU, all right? I had no idea it was a small Catholic university, all right, with a very, very small African-American population. And so what we see now with college athletics in many ways is the overrepresentation, right, of black athletes, men's and women's basketball and football, but nobody talks about it. We act like we don't see it. We ignore it. And it's funny, at the university, because of my administrative position, I get pretty good season tickets. And the first game of every year, I typically sit somewhere else. I know when I sit down, within 3 minutes, Dr. Bradley, I'm going to get the question, does your son play? And I said, no, but they all my cousins, so it's all good, all right? And so I think sometimes when we look at what college athletics has turned into, and I'm at a phenomenal place because this is one of the only places where you have a black head football coach and a black basketball coach. And when Coach Strong wants me to recruit, I do it because he understands that this is about helping young people become successful. I was at a recruiting event with President Fenves, and there was a kid who was deciding between Michigan and Florida, but the kid wanted to come here. He wanted to get in the Macomb School. The head coach told him, he said, I can't promise you that you'll get in the Macomb School. And for those of us who've been around the world of college recruiting, to hear a coach be upfront and honest, and he said, Doc, we're not getting him. He wants to major in business. And then Shaka Smart, I was in China this summer. It was 3 in the morning there, 3 in the afternoon here. My phone rings. I'm thinking it's my children. And I get a phone call from a Richmond, Virginia phone number. And you know, that's $3 a minute if I answer the phone, all right? I'm like, I don't know anybody in Richmond, Virginia. It was Shaka Smart, the basketball coach. Say, Dr. Moore, I heard a lot about you. I heard you out of the country. Let me know when you get back in town. And to talk to him for 90 minutes in China just about his plan to help these young men, as he says it, become the best version of themselves is remarkable. I couldn't necessarily cheer for my previous employer. Sometimes I wanted them to lose, all right? But I think here, yeah, I did want them to lose a lot of times, all right? Probably, it's like, I hope y'all lose this week, all right? But it's been amazing to be here because we see what college athletics can be, okay? Let me roll through a couple of these right quick. Now, this is the Missouri boycott, Missouri Tigers. I don't know about you all, but this is one of those events where, like we knew we were when we found that Tupac got killed and Biggie got killed, right? I knew where I was when this happened because I started getting all these text messages. And I said, the brother said they're not playing? And I said, oh, the president, he's done. I knew that was going to happen. But I think what you saw is student athletes exercising their power. And this shook up higher ed from coast to coast. Because you had about 20 young men on the team who said we aren't going to play. And I know the university was thinking about the bad PR, the loss in revenue. And people said, well, the coach was with him. The coach had no choice because he wasn't going to have a team on Saturday afternoon, all right? And so in many ways, it is powerful. And I think this is one of the images that will go down sort of the 1968 Olympic images. But here, because of Black Lives Matter, right, it has energized a generation of young millennials who we say are apolitical. But here these young men were putting their scholarships on the line saying, no, we stand with the rest of the student body, all right? Let me move on. Now, you might know who coaches this team? Dawn Staley. And what she is doing with these young women at South Carolina is phenomenal. So when I was at LSU for those 9 years, I got to spend a lot of time primarily with male athletes. And then a sister on the basketball team said, Dr. Moore, when you going talk to us. And it was an eye-opener because I was drawn to the males because a lot of the off-the-field behavior. So when I got to LSU, there were 70 African-American males on scholarship. They had fathered 110 children amongst the 70 of them. Nobody was graduating. It was in many ways an outlaw atmosphere, but nobody cared as long as they won ball games. And I remember being there my first semester. I wrote a letter to the president. Me and the provost went to lunch. I said, you got to help me out. The average ACT here is a 26. I have some young men in my class with 16s and 17s. How do I evaluate them as a professor? He said, I don't know. And so over the course of 8 years, we put a structure in place, right, where we encouraged the young men to go to class. We raised the academic bar, letting them know that they could be smart. One young man told me he had never taken a test in his life. I said, but you went to that private elite school in New Orleans. He said, Dr. Moore, I went to school every day at 2:30. But he was a junior and had never taken an exam before. But it was a lot of retail work, right? Going to practice, going to the weight room, trying to connect with them in their environment where their identity was. But a lot of them had never been told that sport is an intellectual enterprise. Have you all ever seen a college football playbook? And the language and the intellect it takes to execute all that in real time in front of 100,000 people in the stands and millions more on ESPN, and you're 18? But when I began to work with these young men, I began to realize the enormous pressure they were under. First and foremost, pressure to go to the league from family, friends, and community. And it starts young when we're 7 or 8, right? When we're at the Baptist church. And the pastor says, little Johnny scored 5 touchdowns today. And we stand up and give him an applause, but we don't recognize the students at the church who are doing well academically. So first and foremost, it was this pressure to go to the league. Number 2, it was that they were unprepared to do college level work. And it's funny, if you ever go to a football practice, it's big on repetition. They will run the same play 20 times to make sure they get it right. But then you come to a classroom, you may sit there for a month taking notes. So in many ways, the learning style. Another issue I found was that they were restricted to majors. If you cannot take a class after 1:30 in the afternoon, your list of available majors goes from this to this. The fourth issue, they dealt with stereotypes from black and white students and black and white faculty. One student said, Dr. Moore, if I do good on the test, everybody says somebody did the work for me, I cheated. But if I flunk the test, they say I don't belong here, I'm dumb. And he said, do you know what it's like walking around at a university where nobody respects your intellect? They just think you're a big, dumb football player. And to hear these stories, to hear them talk about being excluded from study groups. One young man said, Dr. Moore, I'm in a study group in my economics class, but they told me I don't have to do anything. They said, well, you just show up and work the PowerPoint when we get the presentation. And so a lot of times these young men were suffering in silence. And faculty members deliberately putting classes in the afternoon because they didn't want them in their classes, believing that somehow they would diminish the intellectual rigor of the course. And then when you talk to females, the issue's a little different. Let me ask you a question. If I'm a female basketball player and I get pregnant, what happens to my scholarship? And the stories you hear from some of these female athletes, right? Dr. Moore, the coach, one woman told me at one school the coach would confiscate their cell phones the night before games. One coach told the players, if you aren't a lesbian, I'm going to put you on birth control. This is real stuff. And hearing the way some of these soccer coaches talk to these young women, calling them fat and just killing their self-esteem. If you get a chance, go read what happened at the University of Illinois with the women's basketball coach in Illinois, calling the black women ghetto and stuff like that, right? And so there was just these issues out there where A lot of people think that college athletes have it made, they're spoiled, they have the good life. And I say, no, you don't want to get up at 5 a.m. and go work out. Then have a 9 a.m. class. Then got to be back at the facility at 1 o'clock for film, and you get back home at night at 9 or 10 o'clock. It is a rigorous schedule, and that's why I tell people all the time, a college scholarship, athletic scholarship, is not a privilege, it's an earned opportunity. Amen, somebody? All right, let's move on. All right, that's okay. So I'm looking at this right here. Now, this slide was made before last night, all right? Just let you all know, all right? 5 minutes, okay. Unbelievable. 20 years old. The stadium in his grasp, right? But what happens when he can no longer play? What happens when he gets hurt? And so one thing we've tried to do here and other places is help them with their identity outside of athletics. But imagine you've been doing something good since you were 7, and now it's over at 21. I think I got one more photograph, and that'll be it. All right. And so you can do a couple things with it, right? You know, and I tell faculty members that we can lead social movements. We can do more than just write and tweet, right? That we can actually get our hands dirty. So there are a lot of people putting pressure on the NCAA to change from the outside. But what we decided was we need to develop the next generation of leaders within college athletics. And so a year ago, I started a conference called the Black Student Athlete Conference because I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew that there were other people across the country having these same concerns, that talented men and women could just, on the court, could just be as talented in the classroom. And so last year we had a conference, January 2015, about 100 people showed up. This year, about 200 people showed up. And this is the group here: athletic directors, faculty members, graduate students, folks who work in athletic departments. And so what we are trying to do, we are trying to change it from the inside out. And I think we're going to have a lot of success. I believe in college athletics. I believe it creates a ton of opportunities, but it needs to be reformed. You all may have heard that LSU was going to fire Les Miles, the football coach. He had 4 years left on his contract at $5 million a year, and they said they had raised the money to buy him out. Right? And Kevin Sumlin at A&M, they were going to buy him out at $15 million. He was going to be the first brother to get reparations, right? Okay? All right. But I think we missed an opportunity, and I've been saying that the last frontier of the civil rights movement is college athletics. I am just convinced that we can do it right, and we can do it with integrity. And I'm just glad I'm at a place where we have two great coaches, Shaka Smart and Charlie Strong. Thank you. All right.
All right, thank you, Leonard. That was great, and I'm sure we'll get some good feedback and questions from the audience on that. I want to talk about solutions with Charlayne Hunter-Gault, because you're doing a great series on PBS called Race Matters, and I've seen several of them, and the one with Pedro Noguera on education was particularly illuminating. I'd like to talk to you about, right now in 2016, we have all this conversation going on, protests, demonstrations, but at the end of the day, and you alluded to this in your keynote, but what are some solutions on the horizon that you see? And especially in doing this series, you've seen an expansive panoramic landscape where so many people are trying to do solutions, different alliances, multi-generational, multiracial, but black, white, Latino. What are some solutions you're seeing?
Well, first, I think we should take a little break because I don't want to have to follow him. Everybody get up, go to the bathroom, have a couple of drinks, whatever. No, that was just amazing. And I want to talk to you about a solution. As you talked, I heard something that I want to pursue. Where do I start with this? Because it didn't just happen. I've traveled all over the world so that I not only get to look at what Martin Luther King called the beloved community, which is our own country and our issues, but also the global community. People don't seem to realize, or many don't know, that Dr. King, as early as 1954, was engaged not only in looking at issues that challenged America, but also he looked at issues that affected the global community. And there's a wonderful book, if you're not aware of it, it just came out a couple of years ago, called In a Single Garment of Destiny, in which he talked about how we're all here in the beloved community and in the global community, wrapped in a single garment of destiny. So I was still living in South Africa, where I did, in fact, live for 17 years. And I would look back on our country from there and listen to South Africans who tended to be much more politically aware of what was going on in America than many of our own people. But they also looked to America, including especially those who had been a part, who had worked with African Americans and others, a real broad multiracial coalition in the anti-apartheid struggle. So that there was this, this look back at America, which had so helped them out of their own Jim Crow apartheid, but that was having some of the same problems now that this young democracy, were facing. So when I would come home in the summers, starting in about 5 years ago, I started reading books by people who were writing about our race problem in America, our enduring problem, which at that moment was the elephant in the room, because at that point there wasn't a whole lot of discussion even about it. So I called up the head of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, and I said, look, I need some money. I just put it right out there to look into this. And he gave me some money to look into it, and I spent 2 years reading everything that I could find that related to analysis of the problem, but also some solutions. And there were people who had solutions, but nobody was talking about them. Everybody was complaining, but nobody was, except these people who were writing these books. So I collected all these books. I mailed them back and forth between Martha's Vineyard and Johannesburg, just so I could continue the research. And then I began to talk to, I had worked for CNN, I had worked for NPR, I had worked for NBC, and I began talking to all of them about how it would be possible to have an ongoing series, not looking at the problem, but taking the problem and dealing with it with people who had solutions to it. And everybody would say, oh yeah, that's an interesting idea. Come back and blah, blah, blah. Well, finally, last year, under new leadership at the PBS NewsHour, I convinced them to undertake this series. And what is unprecedented about it, in addition to it being a consistent, because I did this once for the NewsHour after the Rodney King incident. We did that for 2 or 3 weeks, and it was interesting. But this was a proposal that I had to do it for 1 year so that it could really get down into the, what do you academics say? We could drill down into it. Is that what you say, academics? That and trope. I haven't figured out how to use trope, but I know that I try to talk academic when I'm in the academic environment. Anyway, to drill down into this thing. And then we finally decided, and I think that part of the catalyst for it was Charleston. It shook us all. Yeah. And so we launched it quietly right after the Charleston massacre with the mayor of Charleston. By this time, by the way, I had maybe 40 or 50 resources, people who had solutions. And of course, I couldn't do all of them in 1 year, but I had good people that I could choose from. And what was important to me was to have diversity within the conversations. I wanted black people, white people, women, men, gays, straight, whatever. And so when Charleston happened, I went there and I had a wonderful conversation with the mayor of Charleston. I knew he had good solutions because I had checked him out and I had watched him perform during that whole crisis. And he had been mayor of Charleston for 40 years, elected year after year, which says something. And there was a group of white people in Charleston who referred to him as LBJ and not the one for whom the school is named. It was a nasty way of referring to him because of the way in which he had brought black people into the government at high levels. So the LBJ stood for Little Black Joe.
Little Black Joe.
This little white man was called Little Black Joe. And he was wonderful. And the difference between an interview and a conversation is that a conversation, it's not what you see on CNN all the time. This is being recorded, isn't it? I better not go there. No, but a conversation, you allow people to think. You don't have to be constantly in their face and say, well, what do you think about it? Well, I don't know. I mean, what is it? Why didn't you do this? And why did you do that? And one of the most wonderful things about that conversation, which then helped me in my formulation of others, was when I said to him, are you optimistic? Because he had done good things for the city, and you could see that. And so I said, are you optimistic? And there was this long pause. And you know, one of the things that television and radio journalists hate is dead air. But in a conversation, you can have it, or at least that was my view of it. So I waited. And his answer was wonderful, you know. He talked about how people are going to we have to see, we have to hope, we have to be optimistic, and it was much more eloquent than what I'm saying now. But it wasn't an automatic, oh yeah, I'm optimistic, oh yeah, I'm pessimistic, but it was thoughtful. We have to work at it. And what it made me think about is something I think about a lot, and that is how prescient our founders were, because they didn't talk about, in the preamble to the Constitution, a perfect union. They talked about a more perfect union, because they understood human nature, that none of us is perfect. We all have our fallibilities. And so that was what he talked about, trying to work towards a more perfect union. So then I began to find other people who had solutions in other areas, like you mentioned Pedro Noguera, one of the best interviews. Well, I think they were all good myself, but some of my friends liked some better than others. For example, the second one I did, I think it was the second or third, was a young man from the Rand Corporation who's done a lot of work on policing. And he said some really amazing things, including the fact that white policemen need to understand the history of African Americans in this country. Now, he's a young man. He even demurred when I first asked him to do the interview because he'd never done a lot of television. He was a researcher, and I talked him into it. He's a little bit green, but he was very good, and he made very good points. So if you read the interview, I think it comes across even better than the actual interview, and he'll be even better the next time he's interviewed. But I find with all of these people, even those who are used to being interviewed, like Pedro Noguera and Darnell Hunt and all of those, you can sit down and you can be comfortable with people, and they know me and they know my history and my work, and they know their subject, and my questions are simple. Tell me about this. Well, how does that happen? And then what do you do next? I mean, basic, simple journalist questions. But then the camera goes off, and then they start talking about something, and that's where it's at, so to speak. Pardon me, English teachers. So that happened the other day with a woman named Beth Ann Hardison, who helped to integrate the catwalks, the fashion walks. And she did it by calling out all of these top designers, and they are all names that you all know. And she said they couldn't understand why she was accusing them of racism because they weren't racist. But she said to them that, well, you can do something that has the effect of racism without yourself thinking of yourself as a racist. But she didn't say that until the end of the interview. My cameraman had packed up all of the gear, and we were just chatting. And when she said that, I said, excuse me, Eric, I'm sorry to have you do this, but would you please unpack, because I must have this on the air, because I think that's really important. It's easy to label somebody a racist if they say something that offends us, that they may not even be aware of what it is. And so part of one of my interviews was with a woman named Linda Trop, who is, I think I talked about this morning, but some of you who were here can close your ears or take a little nap. I'll tell those who weren't here. Linda Trop teaches at Northeastern University, and she talked about the difficulty of having conversations about race. And she said, but no matter how difficult it is, you have to get past those first few efforts at trying to penetrate it. She said, is it doing that? Okay. Yes. She said, it's like when you take up tennis. You put the racket in your hand, you don't hit the ball right into the right place the minute you take it up, or you don't hit aces. You have to practice it. So you have to practice good racial discourse, and you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. Yeah. And she gave examples, and they were excellent examples. Roz Chetty, Harvard, now at Stanford, talked about how your zip code will often determine your future. Mm. If you're born in a segregated community with limited resources, the chances are good that's where you're going to stay, and that's where your life, whatever it is going to unfold.
What was her solution?
What was his solution? Well, there are two solutions. This is what's interesting, because nobody has an optimum solution, but everybody has things that work in the interim and could work if they get expanded. In this instance, they did an experiment somewhere in Texas, but I don't think it was Austin. Might have been Dallas, where they moved a family out of a black family out of a segregated low-income neighborhood into an integrated community where the children could go to good schools that were integrated and they had resources. It wasn't so much the fact that they go to school with white kids, but in the schools where the white kids are is where the resources are. Mm-hmm. Which took me back to when I was in elementary school in the segregated South, and separate and unequal meant that we got the hand-me-down textbooks from the white schools with the pages torn out of them. Mm. So they moved these people as an experiment into these integrated settings, and the children were far more successful than where they had been. However, the other side of that is that you can't move everybody anytime in our lifetimes out of these communities. So what do you have to do? You have to fix those communities too. Mm-hmm. That's where I left Roz Chetty. But then I interviewed Pedro Noguera, mm-hmm. who then talked about how the same point, that it's better if you could have these integrated schools in school, children in schools with great resources. But he said that, and I said, well, wait a minute. But he's all in favor of helping the public schools get better, because that's where a lot of our kids are, mm-hmm. in the public schools. And I said, well, what about the charter schools? Because I've never quite understood the concept of charter schools. I'm sorry to say that, because I probably charter school people in here. But when it started, I was in South Africa, and I just never quite got the concept of how you could have a charter school that selects students, and you have a public school over here and so I said, well, is the charter school the answer? And he said the charter schools are as segregated as a lot of these public schools, because that's where the upper income people see to it that their children get to, which I thought was fascinating. But then he went on to say that even in these segregated schools, if you put in the right resources and have the right perspectives from your teachers, they can be successful. And he gave me examples, one of which is in Massachusetts. He said, first of all, the teachers teach literacy, and that is extremely important in these schools. But secondly, they have resources like social workers, people who help the children learn how to eat. I mean, it's just a whole range of things, but it's support. And this school, segregated as it is, has come out year after year as one of the top schools in Massachusetts. So it doesn't mean that just because it's all black and segregated, it's gonna, turn out poor kids. It's just you have to have an investment in those young people, understanding what their needs are. So that was one of the conversations, and that was one of the solutions. And one of my favorite ones is not too. I guess how far is Montgomery from here? Montgomery, Alabama. Now this is the gentleman. He's now a deputy sheriff. He was police chief at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. And he was so moved by John Lewis, this was last year, the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, that he took off his badge during the ceremony and handed it. It's all over YouTube. Handed it. I wanted to talk to him and find out what was motivating him. So I went there, and what he did when he became police chief in Montgomery was he went to the police academy and he got them to put in a course for the young recruits into the academy on the history of black people going back to the Dred Scott decision. He said because part of what he saw was happening between the black community and the police there is fear on the part of the white policeman who didn't understand if they got pushback from a black person that they were approaching. It could have a history, and they needed to understand that history. Now, that might not work in every situation, but it would certainly begin to have them see African Americans through a different prism, the prism of their history, and it has made a huge difference. So he said many of the same things, but in a much more dramatic way than my young man from Rand, but it was the same idea. And that one's gonna run pretty soon, I hope. I also visited at that same time the Southern Poverty Law Center, because they have people working on all of these issues, including, they put the Ku Klux Klan practically out of business. And how did they do that? By suing them, taking them to court, and breaking their bank. And now they're working on this whole lone wolf situation, which is sort of interesting. I mean, she says it's a very difficult challenge, but you can handle it. And part of how they do approach it, they go into the prisons. And a lot of the people who've been arrested and charged with crimes dealing with white supremacy, they hook them up with other people in the prison, say a black person, and get them to start interacting. And of course it's sort of structured, but it works. It works. And so that's an ongoing situation because this lone wolf thing is new to us. But there are more of them attacking black people.
And you're talking about lone wolf shooters.
Yeah, like white supremacists who are lone wolf. And also they have white supremacists who have come to God. And so they too work with these people to try to change their attitudes about black people. So, all of them say, look, we don't have, we can't tell you when these solutions are going to have a large impact, but we're going to continue to work on them because we've seen the impact they've had in the areas that we're working. Another one, a great one, was out in South Central LA, where a young black man was shot in a drive-by shooting by some gangs, and his mother set up a series of storefronts to bring kids off the street and try to give them a different projection to their lives. And they had all over the walls flags representing University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Harvard, all these colleges that they talk to these kids about and show them a different way. Yeah. And then they mentor them. And so they are, and the woman who's now running the program was a cousin of the young man who was murdered, and she was once one of the Crips, a gang which is still pretty notorious out there. And I said, well, how did you get out of the Crips? She said, my mama. And I said, well, what did she do? She said she got one of her friends who goes to church and made her take me to church. And then she got her involved in a little job in the community where she could earn a little money. But she kept her eye on her. And that's what they're doing with these kids. So, you know, in the end, I don't know if we are going to make a huge dent in this issue of racism with the solutions that we're pursuing, but I think that we are hopefully helping people to have a different look at the possibility in so many different areas that people can work on and work together. And some of it's difficult. Like I said, the conversation can often be difficult. But I'm hopeful that we can, in this discussion that's going on for a year, help us figure out how to get to a more perfect union.
Great. Thank you. Let's open it up. We're going to open it up now for questions from hopefully some students. Where are our students? Do we have some policy students in here, some LBJ? And just...
By the way, I just want to say, how wonderful is it to look out at this rainbow of people in this room? I think, give yourselves a hand. Wonderful to see.
Hi, good evening. I'm Virginia Cumberbatch. I'm a second-year student here at LBJ. And I just wanted y'all's sort of feedback on, you talked about having practice at creating really good racial discourse. And I think oftentimes within the world of academia, and particularly at a public policy school, sometimes the conversation of race is sort of siloed as a special interest conversation. Yeah. And we don't all get the benefit of participating in a conversation that, as we've all learned today, is inextricably linked to almost every social institution. And so I wondered sort of your sort of take on how we make sure that this conversation feeds into any policy discourse, and that it's not just a class that's offered for people who happen to have that particular interest. Yeah, and then I sort of similar to that, I think, you know, as a journalist, you might see that as well, where we have particular entities like the Roots or an NBC Black, where we cultivate that conversation, but kind of within an echo chamber. So how do we sort of monopolize that to the greater public?
That's a really good question, and I think that it brings to mind another conversation I didn't mention, which was I did with an Asian American at Teachers College, Columbia University, on microaggression. And I did it before the Missouri explosion, but it ran around that time. And it was great because all these college campuses that I've been on around the country for the past several years, I kept hearing stories of microaggression and how, you know, you can have a group of black kids talking and a white kid will pass by and say something rude, or sometimes it's not even meant as a negative, but it's spoken. Right. And so I was totally on the same wavelength as those young people out there. But I think that one of the things you need is leadership I think you need leadership from the top, like you're having here, like this conversation that you're having. So, and you know, I was telling somebody today, I went to a memorial service where I expected a lot of people because it was for Julian Bond at Morehouse College, and the chapel was half full.
Wow.
And I remember the time when chapels were compulsory. And I had to leave because there were a lot of people more people on the platform than were in the audience, practically. Well, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But I left, and I'm told that C.T. Vivian got up later and just reamed the administration who was sitting on the dais. But leadership is really important. And there has to be conversations in these institutions that are sponsored by people at the top, who say that this is something important. It's an important part of your experience here, and we're going to talk about it. And you need people though who know how to manage the conversation, like Linda Traub, because when the conversation gets difficult, it's when people want to take it, leave and not pursue it, and you have to go past those moments in order to get to another place. Sharing experiences is very important, and somebody brought up something today about the pushback that you often feel when some white person says something that's just totally ridiculous, and you have to also be prepared to have a civil response if you really want people to understand you and where you're coming from. Now, one young lady, I don't know if she's still here, she said, but why are we always the ones that have to be the forgiving? Why are we always the ones that have to be the explainers? Well, you have the experience. You know what it's like, and you know what you need. And every now and then you have to make the sacrifice for the greater good. That's my position. Now, some of you might disagree with that, and I'm happy to hear that. But I don't mind doing that with people. And I, even in my life now, often have to do it. Especially now when I think our atmosphere in the country is so toxic. And people will just say weird things. And as I told this story this morning, this one woman, anyway, the point was somebody insulted me, not even realizing she had. I won't go through what it was. And the young white woman who was sitting there with me, an Eastern European, said of the woman after she left, some people just have no filters. We have to learn to deal with the people without filters. But we also have to encourage people to say what's on their minds, even when it's painful, if we are interested in arriving at a different place.
Well, Virginia, I think in terms of structurally, in terms of you're here at the policy school, or you're one of ours, a few things. It's got to be both and. There's been some controversy, and there's NPR reporter was trying to talk to me about. There's one major school, I can't remember it now, that just announced a black dorm. UConn. Thank you, Stefan. So UConn just announced a black dorm, and people are asking black male dorm to help black men do well at UConn for graduation rates, affinity, all these different things. And people are saying, well, is this resegregation? And certainly historians know in the context of the 60s and 70s, we had these institutions or these kind of things that were built up in predominantly white universities. I think you need a both-and strategy, because you need, part of what we need in terms of UT, you're going to need more faculty, you're going to need more students, you're going to need more institutional support and resources, but then pedagogically, you need to have a curriculum transformation too, where you're saying that when you think about race, it's not suddenly this thing where you're saying, well, okay, we've got Black and Mexican American studies here, and so anybody who wants it, you got to go over there to get it. Especially for those of us who teach in the policy school, because whether you're talking about race, class, gender, sexuality, this is all connected to policies, right? even historically, when those groups didn't necessarily have the same kind of voice. So certainly public policy has always, for instance, affected women, even when they couldn't vote. Yeah. Certainly public policy has always affected African Americans and poor people. Even, pre-Lyndon Johnson Great Society, poor people don't really have access to the architecture of public policy to try to shape their own anti-poverty strategies. When we think about, besides the civil rights movement, it's really community action programs, and they're not perfect, but Head Start, Mississippi Child Development Group, where you have 30% of some of those boards are low-income people. So I think you're going to need both, and I think we're in a catch-22 because when black people congregate together, or Latinos congregate together, or women congregate together, or have their own groups, people say, well, they're siloing themselves. There's that famous book, Beverly Tatum, right? Why are all the black kids sitting
In the cafeteria.
in the cafeteria together? But it's trying to recognize, and again, what people are calling microaggressions, I'm 43, growing up in Southside Jamaica, Queens, they called it racism. It wasn't micro, it was like, and I've been called, I went to a predominantly white high school. First time somebody was calling me nigger was when I was 13 years old, at Holy Cross High School, and was unbelievable. I did not respond well, and that did not continue. But it was surprising because the school I had been to before was all African American. It was all African American. So you went to Fresh Meadows, Queens, which was predominantly white. And what those white kids saw, the group of us who were sort of integrating Holy Cross High School in 1986, they were calling us everything but children of God when they first saw us. It was unbelievable, right? And so when people say sort of the politics of the 60s, and it's like Charlayne was talking about, what is our experience? There was a point in New York City when I was on a bus going to one part of Queens, the black part of Queens, to the white part of Queens, there was race wars on the bus. And this is the 80s. Everybody talks about Selma and different stuff. And when I was a freshman in high school, Michael Griffith was killed at Howard Beach in December of '86. I'm 14 years old, and my mom's contemplating taking me out of my private school, Holy Cross, because she's feeling it's so unbelievably racist. But the catch-22 is Jamaica High School was a gladiator academy, okay, where I was supposed to go to. So it wasn't that she didn't want me around black people, but this was a place where people were getting shot and killed and knifed in 86, 87, 88, 89, and 90. And that's my New York City. So I went to a New York City that was under racial apartheid, and I helped and volunteered for David Dinkins, right? But so much of the problems we talk about policy-wise from the 60s, 70s, I lived it. Single mom, right? When I told people at Stony Brook that I was going to become a professor, people did not encourage me. They did not encourage me, right? The only reason this all happened is because of the undefeated will of my Haitian mother, who's a saint at 76 years old. That's why it happened, right? Because my mom will break racism before racism or sexism or anything breaks her, right? So the only way we can transform is by being so strong-willed and so indefatigable, right, that we literally bend these institutions to our wills or else. Skip Gates has done it at Harvard. I mean, with the Hutchins Center and African American Studies, they don't love all those black people at Harvard, and we have some Harvard professors here. They demanded and mandated their presence at Harvard University, right? That's what happened. And it started with students, and it started with communities and faculty who knew that transforming this institution was part of a larger project. Everything we're doing here is supposed to connect with trying to transform American democracy in that expansive way where, again, I'm going back to King. King talks about those great wells of democracy because he's defying our history. He's saying that even though the founders didn't include women and that African Americans, the majority of them were slaves, during the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Conventions, he believes in a bigger, more expansive democracy than anyone in this country has expanded. And I believe too. That's why I'm here. I believe too. Ella Baker believed, Fannie Lou Hamer believed, Charlayne Hunter Gault believes, and that's what can change these institutions. So you've got to believe even when all the evidence tells you not to believe, right?
Virginia, let me say this about the dialogue piece. I don't like the whole safe space thing. It has stifled dialogue. It has stifled conversation. People can't ask questions. If they say the wrong thing, they'll be attacked.
Yeah.
So I don't know where we go from here. You know, the office at UT that investigates complaints, they called me into a meeting, and I supervised the office. They said, Dr. Moore, we got these complaints, all right? I said, who made the complaint? They said it was a student from 3 semesters ago. And so they said, Dr. Moore, you need to put a big statement on your front of your syllabus, right, that this class you may say some things that are effective. And so the Gender and Sexuality Center at UT reports to me as well. And some of those students are upset because our director told them, no, this is not a safe space. I can't promise you that you won't get offended. We won't let you get harassed, but if you get offended, you don't leave. You come back and engage. So I don't know what the college classroom will look like. I mean, I record all my lectures now, all of them. Just so a student can't come back and twist something I said, right? And I said there were 560 students in the class, and this person said it. Did anybody else corroborate it? We ain't talk to nobody else. I'm like, what? But that's what we are dealing with. So Virginia, I don't know. And I think as black folk, we have to give white people the room to make a mistake.
Oh, yeah.
Because I know what it's like as a man being in a gender training. And I said, wow, if this is what white people feel like at a diversity training, I would never go.
You know, something else that's interesting, too, is that I said this earlier this morning. Our young people are not being given history. 80% of our teachers in this country are white. The civil rights movement is not taught in the majority of our schools. And there was a school in Little Rock Central High School.
Yeah.
Everybody knows Central High School. And a few years ago, this teacher assigned his students, his civic students, to go back and find someone who was around during the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. Mm-hmm. Find somebody who was around at that period and do an oral history. That project has been so successful. Now, there might be other schools in Little Rock that are troubled, I don't know. But Central High School is now like a little United Nations. And these kids are now, they started writing these essays. One kid, her great aunt was one of the Little Rock Nine. And she said, I didn't realize it was such a big deal until I started talking to her. And she said, and this is what I'm finding with a lot of young black people. They don't know the history. Even there was a young woman on Wall Street, a young lawyer, who said, why do I have to know that? Well, dear one, what are you going to do when you run up against something you can't deal with that is related to your history? You know, but she wanted to just completely dismiss it. So anyway, these kids went back, they did this history, and one of the young black girl whose great aunt was one of the Little Rock Nine said she learned what a big deal it was. And so when the other black students were saying that they didn't know why they had to know this, she did not even realize she was quoting Santayana when she said, if you don't know your history, you're gonna repeat it, you know, which is exactly what Santayana had said. The young white kid, one of them, who was one of the editors, because they eventually did a book, and I'm gonna hopefully interview them on the Race Matters series. He said that what he learned in the course of his doing oral history was that everybody is the other, and that everybody has some unconscious racism in them, whether it's a black person or a white person, and we all got issues of some kind or another when we don't even realize it. You know, years ago, I still today love telling jokes, okay? I'm the big joke teller. I send them online, I get them online, I get them on the phone. So I was at the NewsHour, and I had just finished interviewing a guy and we came back to the makeup room at the same time. So the makeup artist is taking off my makeup, another makeup artist is taking off his makeup, and I'm telling the makeup artist a joke. So he hears the joke and laughs. And he said, "Oh, so you like jokes?" I said, "Oh, I love jokes." And so he tells me a joke. Then I tell him a joke. And this goes on for 15 minutes. So then we decide we should have dinner sometime, not that night. And this is in New York. And so anyway, fast forward, he and his wife, my husband and I, go to dinner at some fancy restaurant in New York. I think that we're going to have drinks and then have hors d'oeuvres. And before we sit down, he starts with a joke. So I said, okay, it's going to be like that. So I came back with a joke. Then he tells a joke. Then I tell a joke. Then he tells a joke. Then I tell an Italian joke.
Oh my gosh.
And soon as we laugh about that, he tells a nigger joke. Now it's not mean.
Right.
I started it, but I mean everybody was telling these jokes, you know. I mean, and it wasn't, and I didn't get offended because he didn't mean it in an offensive way, and it was a funny joke. But that was the last time I've told a racial joke.
Thought that was the last time y'all went out to dinner.
No, that's the thing. I wasn't offended.
You weren't offended.
You know,
I can
because
tell where that story was heading, Charlayne.
you knew where it was going.
I want to get some more questions. Let's get some questions.
I have a question.
But my point here is that we all have to learn how to communicate.
Right.
And while we are often more the victims of that, we sometimes have to look into ourselves as well, or try to understand where it's coming from with some other folks.
Okay. See, that leads me into a question, what you just said. The first thing I would say is I want to thank you for all the work you did in Peniel Lyra Hour. We used to watch, my wife and I used to watch you years ago when I was in grad school. We look forward to watching the news hour just to see your contributions.
Thank you.
Can you tell us who you are?
Dr. Brown, I work here at UT. I work for Dr. Moore, in fact.
Work with me, not.
I work with him, that's right. I have two observations and I have a question.
Sure.
I remember when Martin Luther King said that what they were trying to do in the civil rights movement was to save the soul of America. That phrase stuck in my mind and my heart. And I'll make another observation that the LGBT community, some people get bent out of shape, especially black people, about the way that they have identified with the civil rights movement, and some people think even co-opted some of the methods and language of the civil rights movement. But I think they're onto something. Okay? That's my second observation. And I want to raise this question, which you just pointed to a few minutes ago, that maybe the struggle that we see black people waging in this country, historically even now, is more than just a black-white struggle. White folks may get tired of hearing that, but there are brown people too, Hispanic people in this country, there are women in this country, there are LGBT people in this country who are engaged in the struggle too. Maybe the struggle that we wage can be a prototype. Those solutions you're working on, maybe those can apply generally and more broadly
Absolutely.
to those other communities who are waging struggles too. And I want you to just reflect on that and tell me if you see that as being a valid thing, that this battle that's going on for justice in this country may be something like Martin Luther King says, that we have to wage to save the soul of America. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. And while I argue that race is our enduring problem since the beginning of our country, and I want to deal with that first, I'm happy to move on to others because I think, look, discrimination is discrimination, no matter whom it's against. So I agree with you totally, and I appreciate your observation.
Okay, question? Question?
Is Dr. Elena Schlachta. Thank you all for this wonderful conversation. I'm actually not in the academic sector any longer. I'm the training manager for the National Domestic Violence Hotline here in Austin, Texas. And I want to take us to the college athletics. So we send trainers to go to different college campuses and do healthy relationship training for young athletes. And your talk really helped to emphasize the intersectionality of race and classism and education and the zip code piece, right, that we all come to college no matter what our athletic talents are with different experiences, and it makes me question what would healthy relationship education look like that would be really effective for the young college athlete? I'd love your perspective on that.
Okay, just keep it short.
Yeah, I'll keep it real short. When you deal with the males especially, they're so high profile, right? Talking about the heterosexual brothers, they deal with the range of women. And there's a groupie element that they deal with. And too often, that becomes sort of the prototype for all women that they deal with, all right? And so I think I think for the women, it's funny when you talk to women who play basketball, and you ask when they date anybody, you know what a lot of them say? Dr. Moore, there are some guys I like, but everybody thinks I'm a lesbian because I play basketball. But I think that healthy relationship training is needed. But that whole environment is just different. It's uber competitive, and so I applaud the work that you all have been doing. But I remind people, domestic violence is not a black issue. They want to pin that on Ray Rice and people like that. This has been going on for centuries.
Question.
Hello, my name is Doris Williams, and I came to the University of Texas in 1964, right out of my segregated high school from Texas. That makes me a precursor. And I came today because I wanted to talk to Miss Hunter Gault because she was just so impressive earlier on, and I noticed that she left the United States and moved to South Africa. So I kind of wanted to find out from you, Miss Gault, why you decided to leave the United States and move to South Africa. But before you answer, I'd like to share a story with you. As I was coming this evening, I had stopped off to drop off a pair of shoes at a local shoe store. I won't call the name of it. And while I was in there, the owner of the shop felt comfortable enough with me, we were just doing small talk, to share with me that he thought that President Obama has been the president that has done more to worsen race relations in this country than anybody. He happened to be white, and he shared with me that his parents came from Hungary. So, and then he went on to, I don't know how he tied this other story about Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. He didn't remember his name. He just said this guy who was arrested for, supposedly, they thought he broke into his own house. And I informed him that it was Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Was the person, and it was his own house. And he said, well, yeah, but maybe he should have done more, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. should have done more to kind of get to know his neighbors. And that because if you see a African American, a black man, going into a window, what are you supposed to think? So, I mean, this conversation just went on, and I kind of felt like, I told him, I said, well, we don't know. I don't think we can assume that Dr. Gates did not make an effort to meet his neighbors. We don't know the whole story, so I'm not going to assume that, put the onus on Dr. Gates. But anyway, I said all that to say that when I came in 1964, we had what's analogous now, the Black Studies Department. And so I kind of feel like we aren't making a lot of progress, but we are studying a lot of race relations. We're talking, and I would hope that at some point we would put the ominous on maybe white guilt as opposed to looking at black people and all of the problems that we've experienced. And maybe we should start studying or looking at why white people feel the way that they feel, and maybe there is a guilt. I'm not saying, it seems to be something that I find many white people don't feel comfortable talking about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
First of all, I didn't leave the country because I was pissed off at it. I had been married at that point some 30 years, and when my husband was asked to come and open J.P. Morgan Bank, he's a banker, after the end of apartheid and the end of sanctions, I said, well, you know, you go and I'll stay at the news hour and we'll commute because J.P. Morgan will pay the ticket. He said, fine. Well, you know, that got tired real fast. And so I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who was the foreign editor at NPR, who was looking to move. This is, again, early on in Mandela's tenure. And so he said he wanted to move NPR from Kenya to South Africa, and he was looking for a bureau chief. And I said, well, that's interesting. How soon do you want to do it? He said, as soon as I can find somebody. And I said, well, I've never done radio, but radio is journalism, and how difficult could it be? So 2 weeks later, I told Jim Lehrer I was leaving. He had a fit, but I left. That was why I left. And I had such a good experience because I did NPR for a year, and after that, the CNN bureau chief's job came open, and I hadn't done that before, and I thought that might be interesting. So I moved over there and had a great 5 years with them, and then I wanted to write a book, so I left them all alone for a little while. And it was a great experience because it was the beginning of South Africa's baby steps to democracy, and it was a great moment to be there, to get to know Mandela and his people, and just the whole country was fascinating. But I also covered the entire continent and watched other countries on the continent taking their baby steps and some regressing. So it was a very exciting period. We stayed there 17 years in the process, started making wine, which we bring to this country. So my husband said it was an emotional experience to start with, but now it's an economic pursuit. And so we try to sell wine. But we love the country. It's going through some serious, very serious challenges right now because the current leadership is not what I think people had hoped it would be. And the students, I'm sure all of you are aware of the fact that the students have turned out in the thousands to demonstrate, like our own, you know, demanding that there be more courses about themselves, more books about their own experiences, and more African teachers, because the number of, I think it's something like 5% of the teachers. But, you know, you also have the legacy of apartheid, where many of our young black students there can't even make it in college because they haven't been properly educated. So there's going to have to be some redress in that way. But the problem there is that the vast majority of the black population, which is the majority in the country, are young, under 35, and not equipped for a modern industrial society. So I don't know what's going to happen, but it needs a lot of support, the kind of support that we gave it during the apartheid struggle. Having you people from Harvard and St. Louis and Fairfield and everywhere else you come from here to go down there and spend some time with these young people, because they need to see successful African Americans who understand their history. So essentially, that's it. I'm glad you had that conversation with the guy, and I hope you'll have a little more patience to continue to talk to him and bring him around, because he's not wrong about the election of Barack Obama and the racial situation and the attitudes in this country today. I think a lot of the attitudes that people have, white people in particular, have come out as a result of having a black president. Now that's just you've written about that too.
I've written about it. I think he's part of it. I think
it's not Obama's fault.
Yeah,
it's
there in the society, because I think it's, you know, when we were talking about 2016 earlier. I think when we think about Donald Trump and sort of the phenomena of Trump and what does it mean that you have a candidate who's talking very harsh language about immigration, very harsh language about inclusion.
And women.
And women, is really sort of the champion, has been perceived as a champion in terms of the data, many Americans, right? I think that's connected to Barack Obama. It can be juxtaposed against it. But we have a deeper history that goes beyond Trump. So you've got Strom Thurmond in 1948 walks off Democratic National Convention after Harry Truman, advocates a civil rights plank. Strom Thurmond gets over 3 million votes in the 1948 presidential election. He gets more votes than Henry Wallace. So Henry Wallace is the early Ralph Nader or Bernie Sanders, right? He's not necessarily a Eugene Debs kind of socialist, but certainly social democratic progressive. He gets 3 million votes, but Strom Thurmond gets a couple 100,000 more. George Wallace gets about 9 million popular votes in 1968. Eldridge Cleaver gets about 400,000. So when we're thinking about Trump, he and then certainly Reagan solidifies this. Reagan gets about 50.1% of the vote in 80, but maybe around 57, 58, 59% of the vote in 1984. So Mondale gets Minnesota and D.C. He gets maybe 13 electoral votes. So I think this precedes Obama, but certainly Obama became a flashpoint, and so did healthcare. Healthcare became a flashpoint for millions of Americans. So certainly a lot of the criticism against Obama is purely policy based. And then there's also a lot of criticism that's also racially based, right? And I think as analysts and intellectuals, our job has been to sort of disaggregate that. So just because somebody disagrees with the president's policies doesn't make them somehow a racist. But then there's people who are saying—
Because there are black people who disagree with it.
Yeah, there's black people who disagree with it, right? But then there are people who are saying, hey, this black guy was not born in the United States and I hate his policies. That's tough. There were Tea Partiers who had, placards of Michelle Obama and Obama as monkeys and different stuff. So those are very overt signs of racism, right?
But what was that Charles Blow column I talked to you about today? Because I would like everybody to read
White America's Broken Heart.
White America's Broken Heart. Go online, go to the New York Times, and find it, because it's just a wonderful column, don't you think?
Yeah.
That drills down, I love that, into some of this reaction that you're getting from white people. And I find it just really fascinating. Other people who've talked to me in my Race Matters conversation talk about the fear that, and I said this morning, I hate generalizing about white people this and white people that and black people this, but to a certain extent there is a white fear among some white people about the coming demographic shift that's going to result in majority being people of color and white people being in the minority. I think
Texas is ground zero.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, in the pre-K grades, Latinos 61%. Right, K through 12, about 52%. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of, it's going to hit Texas first. And being from Cleveland, where there really wasn't a large Latino population, being in Texas has been interesting for me because you got this other dynamic. And I remember moving here and a white realtor telling me, don't move to that neighborhood, there's too many Mexicans over there. Mm-hmm. But I also have 11 aunts and uncles in Los Angeles who started off in Compton, Inglewood, South Central, and the way they talk about Mexicans, it's the same rhetoric that white homeowners had toward black folks during the Second Great Migration. It's the exact same rhetoric. They've all migrated to the Inland Empire, Rancho, Riverside, places like that. But they will talk about how the Compton was a great neighborhood until the Mexicans came.
But that was one of the things that the woman I interviewed in South Central about the gangs and stuff talked about, because I asked her about how was what they were doing going to affect race relations. And my question was intended to talk about black, white in the country. But what she started to talk about is how she's teaching these black kids, as well as the Mexican kids, the history of Mexicans and what they did in the founding of Los Angeles, and teaching them about history. I keep going back to history, but again, with your guy up there, you need to teach him some. If you still have the patience to talk to him, take him my book.
we should go pick her
Take
shoes
him
up.
a history book and say, look, I understand where you're coming from, but let me just say, I mean, if that's important, that's what I do with some people. But not everybody's going to be receptive. But my husband accuses me of talking to everybody, and I do. In Sarasota the other day, they had they have it every year. It's a motorcycle racing convention. These guys come in on the Harleys. Their girls are on the Harleys, and they just take over the town. The streets are closed down, and they're all. And my own stereotypes of them suggest that these are people who probably don't like me. So I go to the bank, and there are about 5 of them there taking a break, and their Harleys are there. And I walk over and I say, oh, wow, look at these. Which one of these do you think would be best for me to ride if I decided that I wanted to ride them? And they looked at me like I had lost my mind. It didn't matter to me. I kept talking. Eventually, I got these guys talking to me. Now, did that make a whole lot of difference in the total scheme of things? I don't think so, but maybe it did. Maybe it did. I enjoyed it because they saw somebody they hadn't seen before in a black woman. And, it helped me out that day.
All right, I think on that note, we're going to close. Thank you, Charlayne Hunter Gault. Thank you, Dr. Leonard Moore.